Hello, and welcome to this breakout session. The Crane Center Symposium is always one of my favorite days of the year, and it's been great so far, and I think that's going to continue this afternoon. We're looking forward to continuing our look at early, broad, and sustained investments in children and families, and to an active and engaging discussion in this session. This session will look specifically at the expectations put on early childhood as a magic bullet to fix all of society's future educational and economic ills. Our panelists will also highlight where we should go from here. Before I say more, let me introduce myself. I'm Kelly Pertel, and I'm a Crane Faculty Associate and an Associate Professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology here at Ohio State. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Arya Ansari. Arya is also a Crane Faculty Associate and Assistant Professor of Human Sciences at Ohio State. His research focuses on how contextual factors influence early childhood development. And in particular, he often studies children who are experiencing low income. His goal with his work is to intervene and inform policies that can minimize the opportunity gap in the US. He earned his PhD at the University of Texas, and we are really excited to have him here at Ohio State now. As you can see, he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. I invite you to participate in an active and engaging discussion using both the chat box and the question and answers. We will have time for him to answer your questions at the end, but we're also all here to learn together and be inspired to take action in our own settings. My colleague Janelle is here, and she'll be monitoring the chat box and keeping you updated with any housekeeping items. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ansari.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Let me get my slides up for you all. Can everybody see? I'm gonna assume so.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. So thanks for that kind introduction, Kelly. Today, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all about everything in the kitchen sink and why we expect so much of early education programs. I want to begin by setting the groundwork for kind of where we're going for the next hour. I'm going to spend about 40 to 45 minutes talking with you all about the subject matter, and then we'll open it up for more in-depth Q&A. And more specifically, here is what the agenda looks like. I'm going to start by briefly talking about the problem and premise of early childhood education, or ECE for short. Then we're going to turn to the promise, the broken promise, the long-term expectations, and then we're going to close with a focus on the need for continued investments. But before we begin, I want to pose a question for you all that, you can type in your thoughts in the chat. Something I want you all to think about for the next hour, but also something I want you all to think about as you go back to your respective lives and your day-to-day jobs, which is how, at the end of the day, do we improve educational experiences to support the development of children in the long term, especially for children from marginalized and low-income communities? Again, would love to hear your thoughts, but something that I want all of us to think about in the long term. So with that said, let's jump right in. And I want to begin by talking about the problem, which is that many children are entering kindergarten struggling in key areas of kindergarten readiness. The numbers and estimates vary across the country from community to community. But here in our own backyard in Franklin County, 3 out of every 5 children are not ready for kindergarten in key areas of literacy, social skills, math, and physical and motor development. That translates to roughly 60% of young children who are unprepared in these critical areas. And it's not just that all children have an equal likelihood of not being ready for school. We see tremendous gaps in opportunity. National studies show that children from the lowest income households, they enter kindergarten up to 22 months behind their most advantaged peers and classmates. So already at the age of 5, we see that there is roughly a 2-year gap in key domains of language, literacy, and math development. which is truly heartbreaking when we also recognize the fact that once these children fall behind as early as age 5, they oftentimes continue to stay behind throughout their educational careers. And so it's in recognition of this problem that investments are being made in early childhood education. The premise is that every child will have access to a highly effective early childhood education program before they enter kindergarten for the very first time. I want to acknowledge that early childhood education can take many forms. There are a variety of funding streams. Some programs are housed in schools, some programs are housed in community centers. But I would argue there are some essential elements. These programs use effective curriculum, which can guide teacher lesson planning and day-to-day activities. These classrooms and programs have high-quality teacher-child interactions. We know that more emotionally supportive and organized classrooms make a difference in the lives of young children. These classrooms don't just focus on basic rote skills like ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, but they also place an emphasis on more abstract skills, such as language development, executive functioning, and socio-emotional development. These programs hire a trained workforce. We know, after all, that a more educated and experienced workforce makes a difference in the lives of young children. And these programs also use readiness assessments. And here I don't mean pencil and paper assessments of what children know academically. What I'm talking about is teachers keeping track of what children know, where children started from in these programs, what kind of progress they're making, what their strengths and weaknesses are, so that teachers can create a more individualized learning environment for the children in their classrooms. And it's going to require a program of this nature, of sufficient intensity to help minimize gaps. Again, 22 months is not a trivial number. So it's going to require a program of a sufficient dosage to help put a dent into it. And so with that premise, the expectation is that if we provide it, children will enter kindergarten more ready in core areas of language, literacy, math, socio-emotional skills, physical, motor. But as some of you may have heard, there's also some expectations among certain stakeholders, or there are conversations had about much longer term impacts or benefits. That it's not just that a year of early childhood education will prepare children for school, but it will set the stage for success in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, in adulthood. That a 1 or 2 year program at best will have impacts 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. We'll get to that. But I want to begin by talking about the immediate term expectations. The promise is that children who have the luxury of attending early childhood education, what decades of evidence suggests, both experimental and quasi-experimental studies, is that those children who attend these programs, they enter kindergarten more ready academically, talking about language, literacy, math skills, relative to children who do not attend these programs. Graduates of early childhood education have also demonstrated stronger cognitive skills. Here, what I'm talking about is cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control. And under certain conditions, graduates of early childhood education have also been found to demonstrate stronger social and emotional skills, such as interpersonal relationships, fewer externalizing symptoms. Benefits across all these key domains is what we have found. And under the right conditions, enrollment in early childhood education can help minimize opportunity and achievement gaps that exist at kindergarten entry. Unfortunately, this promise is sometimes broken because not all children in our country are lucky enough to experience early childhood education or effective and high quality experiences before they step foot in K through 12. So what do we see? We see nationally that children from middle and high income families, 66% of those children experience some type of formal early childhood education program. For children who are lower income or in poverty, that estimate drops to 51%. So there's roughly a 15 percentage point gap in enrollment and access to early childhood education programming. Now, let's say families and children get a foot in the door, they get a slot. Well, then there's unequal access to quality programming. We have found that children in high poverty communities are over twice as likely to experience ineffective instruction in early childhood education programs. And in rural communities, only 4% of children have access to high quality teaching across the early years of education. So great inequities in terms of access to the types of programs that are most effective. Now, let's say parents and children get a foot in the door into these high quality programs. There's also then, in turn, inequalities in who shows up on a regular basis, which is known as absenteeism. Although when I mention this term absenteeism, you might be thinking to yourself, this is an issue that emerges or is a teenager's issue, right? They're ditching school. In truth, though, the peak of absenteeism before the high school period is in preschool. Here in our own backyard, in Columbus City schools, 74%, 3 out of every 4 preschoolers, is missing so much time that they're classified as chronically absent, meaning that they miss at least 10% or more of instructional time. And it's those very children who stand to benefit most from these programs who are at greatest risk of not showing up on a regular basis. And why does this matter? Well, we know that if children don't show up, they do not and they cannot reap the benefits of these programs. And so why do I raise these points? Well, I raise these points because, as Deborah Sipek writes, there are many reasons to believe that early childhood education could have much more impact than it does. Its value as an investment should not be judged by its current impact, but by its potential. So if we have these lofty expectations, both in the short and long term, then we need to be thinking about how we can boost early benefits, ensuring equal access, ensuring children show up is a critical first step. Now, let's say we address all those issues, right? Early childhood education, children have equal access. They show up on a regular basis. They enter kindergarten more ready to learn. What about those long-term expectations? That children will be more successful in elementary school, and middle school, and high school, and beyond. Where does this expectation come from? This expectation stems from a lot of work that was done in the 60s and 70s with Perry Preschool and the Abecedarian Project, which found that children who experienced early childhood education programs in the long term were less likely to be engaged in crime. They were more likely to be employed, had greater earnings over their lifetime. such that for every dollar invested in early childhood education, there was a $4 to $6.60 return on that investment, which is truly remarkable. If you come to me and tell me if I can make an investment and you will make my investment grow by 4 to 6-fold, I would give you my money right then and there, right? That's a no-brainer. But what I want to emphasize is that the bar today is far higher than it was 50 to 60 years ago when these landmark and instrumental studies were done. Parents of low income today typically have more years of education. The family unit today is far smaller than it was 50 to 60 years ago. Today, children who don't get into an early childhood education program have far greater access to alternatives than they did 50 to 60 years ago. So parents today are able to invest more in their children, make more concentrated investments in or concerted investments in their young kids. And a child who does not end up in program A, which might be their parents' preference, may end up in program B or C. So the landscape of early childhood education is fundamentally different. When we compare things today to 50 to 60 years ago, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And for the record, children in the Abecedarian study received full-time and high-quality educational services, not just for a year, which is oftentimes what we're talking about today, or at best 2 years, but those children received services from birth through age 5, which again is fundamentally different from the conversations we're having here today. All the reasons why the bar today is higher than it was in the times of Perry and Abecedarian. And so for these very reasons, there's been a great deal of interest in understanding what the impacts of early childhood education services looks like for children's academic achievement in more contemporary cohorts of children. And so studies that have evaluated work that has evaluated the benefits of over 60 to 70 early intervention or early childhood education services have been done to sort of synthesize what we know. And I want to present that for you all here in this chart. Just to quickly orient you to this chart, what we have on the x-axis is the years since children exited their programs. Then what we have on the y-axis is the magnitude of program impacts. Bigger numbers here means greater impacts. So what have these studies found? Well, on average, children who experience early childhood education, they enter kindergarten more ready academically, as can be seen by the blue dot. The magnitude of this benefit or the magnitude of this impact is moderate. But as these children have been followed over time, what studies have found is that that initial boost or that initial impact sort of drops as children transition to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, such that by the end of third grade, 4 years after program exit, that initial impact is approximately 75% smaller. Much of what is reflected in this synthesis or in these reviews has been a focus on state-mandated assessments or assessments of math and literacy skills. ignoring a lot of other ways in which early childhood education might benefit children. And so it was in recognition of this fact that the Institute of Education Sciences back in 2016 funded the Early Learning Network, which was a national community of scholars who came together across 5 different communities to assess the benefits of early childhood education for children as they as they enter early childhood programs and as they enter kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. And so I want to take a moment to talk about what was found in 2 of the sites that my colleagues and I have been interested in, specifically in the state of Virginia and in the state of Ohio. I'm going to present the results of outcomes that are represented on the x-axis, including literacy, vocabulary, math, inhibitory control, social skills, and task orientation, both at kindergarten entry and kindergarten exit, which will be in blue and gold respectively. And then on the y-axis, what we have is the magnitude of program benefits. Again, higher scores are better. So what have we found? What have my colleagues and I have found? Well, what we see is that children who have the luxury of attending early childhood education, they enter kindergarten demonstrating stronger literacy, vocabulary, math, and inhibitory control skills. This is true both in the state of Virginia and in the state of Ohio. Yes, there are some differences in the magnitude of benefits. They're slightly greater in the state of Virginia than they are in Ohio. But in the main, the general pattern is children benefit in multiple domains. But as we fast forward time and see where children end up at the end of the year, we see that across the board, these benefits are considerably smaller. But if we look at this chart a little bit more carefully, we see some striking patterns. These benefits for literacy skills drop to a far greater extent than some other domains. For literacy skills, what we see is that the magnitude of that benefit at kindergarten entry of early childhood education drops by about 80% by the time children are leaving kindergarten. Whereas for outcomes such as vocabulary, yes, those benefits also drop, but they drop to a lesser extent by approximately 60%, which suggests that as we're thinking about do benefits persist, we need to be thinking about whether benefits persist more or less for different outcomes, because different patterns can and do emerge. And as we're thinking about the diminishing benefits of early childhood education, this is oftentimes recognized as convergence. And this convergence can result from one of 2 reasons. It can result as a function of catch-up, whereby graduates of early childhood education, or my apologies, children who did not attend early childhood education are the ones who are making ground and catching up with their peers who did not attend early childhood education, or who did attend early childhood education. Or it can result from fade out, whereby graduates of early childhood education are actively losing ground. They're losing skills. They are forgetting. And that's why the benefits of programs diminishes over time. Catch up, fade out. And this is a central issue that we were also interested in addressing in our work. And I want to pose what we found for you all here in this slide. And I'm going to present it to you in a similar format for both literacy and math outcomes on the x-axis, for children who did not attend early childhood education in blue and children who did in gold. And what I'm going to present to you all is how much these children gained in the kindergarten year. Did non-attenders make greater gains, or did early childhood education graduates lose skills? Well, what we found was that children who did not attend early childhood education in the following year in kindergarten demonstrated sizable gains in literacy and math. The gains in literacy were roughly double the gains in math. Graduates of early childhood education also made sizable gains. Again, greater in literacy than math. All groups are making progress in that kindergarten year. They're developing, they're building on the skills they bring in to school. But those children who did not attend early childhood education, what you can also see from this figure is they're making somewhat larger gains relative to children who did attend early childhood education programs in the year prior. And it's because they're making larger gains that we're seeing evidence of convergence. This convergence in program benefits is not, or is, due to non-attenders catching up to their peers who attended early childhood education. It is not due to graduates of early childhood education losing skills or their skills fading over time. It's about catch up, not fade out. And you might be thinking to yourself, what might explain this catch-up effect? Well, there are a variety of reasons, or there are a variety of factors that might be at play. For example, we know that children who attend early childhood education, they go on to experience redundant instruction in kindergarten. Roughly 37% of the language, literacy, and math instruction they experience in ECE and in kindergarten is redundant. There is very little vertical alignment between these early childhood programs and the kindergarten classrooms. What children are being taught, or what graduates of ECE are being taught, don't necessarily map onto what they actually know. Early childhood education programs often focus on more rote skills, on skills like the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, which are the very skills that kindergartners learn rapidly in the very first months of school. Early childhood education programs spend less time on more abstract skills, such as language, executive function, social and emotional skills. And this is not to create a false dichotomy, right? It's not to say, focus on abstract skills, don't focus on rote skills. The question here is, what is the right balance? There's also evidence to suggest that graduates of early childhood education end up receiving less one-on-one time with their kindergarten teachers relative to non-attenders, which is problematic because what this means is that they are potentially experiencing a less individualized classroom learning environment. It's also pretty clear that classroom learning opportunities look very different in early childhood programs than they do in kindergarten. Early childhood programs oftentimes are more child-directed, center-oriented. Kindergarten classroom, we have seen evidence over the last decade, has become far more academic and teacher-directed. And this is not to say one is better than the other, but what this is to say is that that's a pretty jarring experience when you've spent a year in a classroom that looks like this and ends up being a totally different way in the kindergarten year. And we also know that graduates of early childhood education end up experiencing less coordination in classroom and home learning, which again is a missed opportunity. And while none of these factors individually might or do explain the catch-up effect, you can imagine that if we add one to another and then to another, this kind of begins to snowball, right? And perhaps it's the collective experience that ultimately is what contributes to this catch-up effect. And this catch-up effect and this convergence effect is a reality. We see this today. We've seen this with peri-preschool. We've seen this with abecedarian. But just because we see a catch-up effect or a convergence effect, this does not mean that we should give up on early childhood education programs. What this means is we need to continue to invest. We need to double up our investments in these programs and in K through 12. Because, as Jeannie Brooks Gunn wrote almost 20 years ago, to expect the effects of early childhood education to be sustained throughout childhood and adolescence at their initial high levels, in the absence of continued high quality schooling, is to believe in magic. But here we are 20 years later, talking about the same exact things, the same exact issues, having the same lofty expectations of programs that serve children for 1 to 2 years at best. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is there just isn't that much data that has been able to successfully track children from early childhood into elementary school and beyond. There is a financial cost, right? For every year that we follow children, that costs more money. And so there's a lot of work that tracks children through the end of the early childhood education year. There's some work that follows children into kindergarten and maybe first grade. And the Early Learning Network has followed children into third, and now in this year, the fourth grade year. But there is very little work that has tracked children year over year over year over year to understand what this continuous experience for children looks like from early childhood, in elementary school, and beyond. And so this was an issue that my colleague and I were interested in addressing. And I'm going to talk about very briefly 2 studies that we did. The first of which was to understand whether the benefits of early childhood education, or the academic benefits of early childhood education, vary as a function of their subsequent school environments, in recognition of the fact that the school context matters. It matters for the types of opportunities children have. It matters for their classroom experiences. So to what extent are those academic benefits children derive from early childhood education programs conditional on these subsequent school environments? And so to address these questions, we use data from the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Kindergarten Cohort of 1998, which is now a little over 20 years old. But it is one of the few data sets that actually has all the pieces of information that we need to really address the points raised by Jeannie Brooks Gunn. It is a nationally representative data set that included over 15,000 children who came from racially and socioeconomically diverse backgrounds across all 50 states and all communities in our country. These children were followed through kindergarten entry and kindergarten exit, and then followed periodically in the springs of 1st, 3rd, and 5th grade. And so what we did was use information from parents who reported on their children's enrollment in early childhood education at kindergarten entry. They were asked a series of questions about what types of programs children experience, how many hours their children attended different programs. And based on that information, what we did was create an indicator of early childhood education enrollment, which we defined as any center or school-based program that children experience for at least 5 hours per week. All other children who did not meet that criteria were classified as non-attenders. So that was our focal early childhood education indicator. Then, as children were in the elementary school period, their principals and school administrators reported on the elementary school environment and several different indices of school quality, including things like school strain, school academic performance, school instructional resources, school climate, school violence and crime, which we use to create our index of elementary school quality. And so that was our second focal variable. Then throughout this period of data collection, children's academic skills, which included both math and literacy, were directly assessed with tools developed by the National Center for Education Statistics, which we use to create a composite of academic achievement. And so what we did was estimate a series of models that looked at the role of early childhood education in combination with subsequent elementary school environments and what those associations were with academic outcomes, controlling for a host of demographic and community characteristics in order to identify the unique associations of interest. So what did we find? I'm going to present the results to you in a very similar format as earlier slides. X-axis is going to correspond to the years since children exited their programs. 0 would be the children are still in the early childhood education program. 1 would be the end of kindergarten, so on and so forth. Y-axis corresponds to the magnitude of these benefits. So how much did children benefit from these programs? And I'm going to plot or present the benefits of early child education for children who go on to experience low and higher quality elementary schools in blue and gold respectively. So what did we find? We find that children who attended early childhood education, they enter kindergarten 6 months later, demonstrating stronger academic skills, regardless of whether they attended a low-quality elementary school in the future or a high-quality elementary school in the future. And while these two dots may look different from one another, statistically speaking, they were not. So the benefits of early child education were indistinguishable as a function of elementary school environments, which makes sense, right? Children haven't really been exposed to those environments quite yet. So what happens when we track children over time? Well, by the end of kindergarten, we see that both groups are losing or those benefits are dropping a little bit, right? And so if we stop right here, as is often the case, we might argue that there are no benefits of, or these benefits don't vary as a function of subsequent school environments. They end up at the same place. But if we track children over time through 1st, 3rd, and 5th grade, what we find is that there is this divergence. The benefits of early childhood education are more persistent when children go on to experience higher quality elementary schools. As you can see in gold, it stabilizes relative to children who go on to experience lower quality elementary schools, which significantly drops. So the portrait becomes far more nuanced when we take a longer-term perspective. Of course, I want to acknowledge that that's a school context perspective, right? A lot of contemporary studies today argue that we need to think about the role of interactions and what's going on in the classroom environment. That is far more important, what some contend. And there is promising evidence from work done with the NICHD study of early childcare and youth development, which finds that the quality of teacher-child interactions in the childcare years or in the early childhood years is predictive of higher academic test scores all the way through the age of 15, which is truly remarkable. So what my colleagues and I were interested in was whether those long-term academic benefits children derive from these higher quality early childhood education programs is conditioned on the quality of their classroom experiences in elementary school. And so what we did to address these questions is use data from the NICHD study of early childcare and youth development, which involved approximately 1,300 children who were recruited in the 90s and followed all the way through the end of age 15 in the mid-2000s. Yes, these data are also a little old, but these are one of the only data sets, or this is one of the only data sets that actually has information on the quality of children's experiences in the first decade of education. The quality of caregiver interactions in the early childhood years was measured with the observational record of the caregiving environment, which assessed the emotional and instructional supportiveness of the classroom. Then in first, third, and fifth grade, the quality of those very same domains was assessed with the classroom observation system. Those two served as our focal indicators of interest: quality in early childhood, quality in the elementary school window. And then children's academic test scores or academic skills were assessed with the Woodcock-Johnson, which included math and literacy skills. And so what we did to understand the unique and combined effects of quality of education across this 10-year window is estimate a series of models that, again, similar to the earlier study, controlled for a lot of demographic, community, and community characteristics. So what did we find? Again, very similar format in terms of results. X-axis is years since program exit, Y-axis corresponds to the magnitude of benefits, and I'm going to present the benefits of higher quality childcare when children go on to experience lower quality classrooms in elementary school and higher quality quality classrooms in elementary school, in blue and gold respectively. And we're going to benchmark this against this gray line here that you see. Recall that I said there is evidence to suggest that children who experience higher quality childcare demonstrate stronger academic test scores all the way through the age of 15, and that's what this gray bar corresponds to. And so what we were interested in this study is to understand how much variation is there in these benefits as a function of what happens next. And so what we find is that at the end, or when children are still in their early childhood programs, elementary school quality doesn't matter. And again, that makes a ton of sense, right? The future should not predict the past. But what happens as we track children over time? Well, by the end of kindergarten and first grade, we see some minor differences. But again, if we stop here, as is often the case, we actually see no statistical evidence of subsequent environments moderating early childcare benefits or the quality of early childcare and early childhood education programs. But as we track children's experiences year over year over time, what we find is divergence in these benefits. For children who have the luxury of experiencing higher quality elementary schools, the benefits of higher quality childcare grow threefold, which is not the case for children who do not have that luxury. Those benefits go closer to zero over time. So again, that longitudinal perspective is critical. So I know that's a lot. What are my take-home messages for you all here today? The first one is there are big gaps. There are sizable gaps. Children from historically marginalized communities enter kindergarten behind, up to 22 months, according to some estimates. Early childhood education is effective. It provides children with a sizable boost for kindergarten. It mitigates or minimizes some of the opportunity gaps that do exist in this country. But there is important differences, or there is inequality in access and inequities in who shows up. At the end of the day, we cannot blame early childhood education programs if they fail to live up to their promise. What we should consider at that point in time is how do we make it better with a focus on inputs? No one ever asks, does first grade work? But we keep asking, does early childhood education work? And it's not to take early childhood education off the table. What we need to be shifting our focus and attention to is how do we make it better? Early childhood education cannot do all the work. It is unreasonable, unrealistic to expect that a program that is provided to children for 1 or 2 years will inoculate children from a lifetime of poverty or inoculate children for a lifetime. That's just not realistic. And the benefits that do diminish for early childhood education graduates, they diminish over time because non-attenders, those who did not attend those programs in the year prior, are catching up. It's not because graduates of early childhood education are losing skills or their benefits are fading out. And we have to ask ourselves, isn't that the role of education? To help children make progress? But at the end of the day, what this all suggests is that if we want to boost the long-term benefits of early childhood education, what we need to do is provide high quality experiences in the early childhood years, in K through 12. We must build on all the skills and unique assets children bring to the table in order to ensure that we're meeting each and every single child's individual needs. And so with that, I thank you all for your time, and I will open it up for questions.
Thanks so much for a really wonderful talk, really thought-provoking. We have a few questions already, so I'll go ahead and ask them. But feel free to keep sending in more questions to all of you in the audience. Well, I'm going to start with the one that I just saw pop up. Going back to your slides about absenteeism, have there been any studies as to why why there is chronic absenteeism in early childhood programs? Is it about transportation, chronic health, other things? What do we know about that?
Sure, yeah. So it's a multifaceted issue, which makes it very complicated to address, right? We know transportation is a critical issue for a lot of families. Having a school bus take children to school reduces rates of absenteeism. But we know there's a lot of other issues as well. Especially in the early childhood years, there is sort of some misconception among certain parents or families that it's more about play, it's less about learning. So if I keep my child at home, it's not a big deal. They won't miss too much. But that is not the case. We have seen time and again that absenteeism matters just as much in early childhood as it does in the later years. And if anything, those early absences set the stage for longer term absences. And so there's these misbeliefs that we need to be more systematically addressing. But from a why is this happening? It's a multifaceted issue. There's health reasons, there's transportation issues, there's systemic issues in terms of what children are experiencing with respect to inequities. And so it's going to require a multifaceted approach to tackling it, as opposed to any one type of nudge or intervention program.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Jennifer Bostic asks about dosage and what about the dose of EC services? There's so many variations in programs. We have half day and full day and varied number of days of the week. Do we know anything? Like, is there a minimum amount that's helpful?
Yeah, so I think the Virginia and Ohio examples are an interesting contrast, right? What I showed was Virginia benefits were slightly larger than they are in Ohio, and that can reflect a multitude of factors, including the dollars that are actually being invested in these programs, the dosage of these programs. And so there is evidence to suggest that full-time programs do make there's some experimental evidence that show that full day programs or programs that serve children for longer hours do benefit them to somewhat a larger degree, academically speaking. But there is, I think, a complex set of factors that are at play that sort of, when you're thinking about the input side of things, that can minimize or amplify that initial boost that we were talking about.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you to go way back to the very beginning of your presentation for the next question. And you talked at the very beginning about effective instruction and ineffective instruction. And Angela Hagley asked, can you just go into a little bit of detail about what you're referring to when you talk about ineffective instruction?
Sure. So I believe that is in reference to the rural and high poverty schools in terms of the instruction children are receiving. Those studies are more strictly talking about, or what they were examining was the quality of the school environment or the classroom environment. So thinking about instructional supportiveness, emotional supportiveness, and the organization of the classroom environment. So when I was referencing the effectiveness or lack thereof of the classroom, it was from the perspective of emotional, instructional, and classroom organizational support.
Great. Samantha Peterson asks, she's curious if any studies also focus on parent involvement. So even if a child experiences a low performing elementary school, but has high parental involvement, does that make a difference in the child's ability to do well, kind of regardless of ECE experience?
Yeah, so this is an incredibly important point, right? Because these programs, as I mentioned, are there for a year or two, but parents are there throughout the life of that child. So there is evidence that parental involvement matters, parental engagement matters. It matters well beyond the early childhood window when parents are engaging with schools. So parents who are more involved in early childhood education programs with children's teachers, those kinds of that kind of engagement that sort of changes the home environment or results in improvements in the home environment. They become more engaged, they're more likely to read, they're less likely to engage in controlling behavior, and all that sort of sets the stage for longer term success in kindergarten and first grade for children, both in terms of academics and socio-emotional development. So there is that evidence, and there is also evidence to suggest that certain aspects of parental engagement and parenting do help sustain the longer term benefits of early care and education programs. So when children end up having more sensitive and warm parents, those early benefits of early care and education programs are more likely to persist over time. So parenting is a central component or a central part of the equation, and it's not one that we can sort of neglect when we're thinking about the longer term benefits of programs or why these programs may not result in long-term benefits.
Yeah, great answer. We have more and more good questions coming in. So Ellen was curious in the source for the dollar investment leads to the $4.10 to 660 total return. And if you don't have the exact source, I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit more about that calculation.
Yeah, so that source is from the work done in Perry Preschool and Abecedarian Project, where they track children who receive these early educational services. Abecedarian was services from 0 to 5. Perry was the preschool period. Those children, those studies done in the 60s and 70s have followed children well into their 40s at this point and have tracked a host of outcomes, including academics, but also some of the more crime, employment outcomes, the annual earnings. And so how those studies have calculated it is a function of how much that program costs or how much those investments cost on the front end and how much those advantages in the long term, what those advantages look like for those individuals relative to those who did not. So as our earlier speaker, keynote speaker said, it's oftentimes those annual earnings alone that help cover those initial costs. And so that's where that $4 to $6.60 return on that investment is coming from.
Yeah, it's so important. I've seen so many different statistics, but all of them are just incredibly striking in terms of how much we get back by investing early.
Absolutely.
The next two questions in my mind kind of go together. So I'll ask the first. This one's also from Jennifer Bostic. Do you have any information on what percentage of parents aren't interested in sending their kids to EC? So she gives the example that in rural Ohio, it's not necessarily considered something everything does or should do, especially since we know there aren't any state requirements or other requirements on it.
Yeah, so that's an incredibly important point. I don't have an estimate for you off the top of my head, but what I can, I do think the heart of the question is really important, right? As we're talking about early childhood education programming, we oftentimes think of center and school-based programs, but it's important to acknowledge that that doesn't meet the needs of all families, right? A 9 to 12 or 9 to 5 situation doesn't necessarily work for families that are working multiple jobs or are working evening shifts and things of that nature. And so those families may need to rely on family childcare providers or programs that provide care in the evenings and things of that nature. And so I think the important point to take away is that there's not going to be a one size fits all solution. If we provide it, will everyone come? No, because it might not meet their needs. And so we need to think about in our communities, what are the needs of families? What are the needs of children? And how can we structure the types of services we provide so that it fits each individual community?
Yeah. So I think what Jennifer's question and your answer raises is the fact that we know currently not all kids attend ECE or preschool as you presented, but that's also, potentially not going to change. It may not be that everyone attends it. So Janelle asked if any of the early learning network study has looked at the home learning environments of non-attenders. So are there non-attenders that are still receiving more educational experiences at home? And how might that influence their kindergarten readiness and their long-term success?
Yeah, so one of the unfortunate aspects of the early learning network, right, was, and a lot of studies in this space that sort of don't have a randomized control trial are, they recruit children who did not attend early childhood programs as they enter kindergarten. So there is not as much data on what were your experiences. Parents retroactively report on, like, my child was here, they spent time in this type of setting, this type of environment, but there isn't great retrospective data on what were those day-to-day experiences like, which is incredibly important, right? If a child is getting an incredibly rich experience at the home with siblings and children, that's very different from a child who might not be getting that kind of investment on the home front. And so I think that is something we need to be more carefully considering and examining. But in terms of the early learning network sites that I've at least been involved with, there hasn't been as much information on that front.
Yeah, it's such a challenging one. Speaking as a researcher, it's really hard to find families before they're using preschool or going to elementary school. And so it is often the case that we don't know about their preschool experience until they enter kindergarten. And it's something we need to get more creative at, I think, because I do think, just being a non-attender, that's a broad category with a lot of different experiences. And so it's an important direction for, I think, everyone to think about in the future. As moderator, I'm going to take the last question because we've heard a lot today about investment, and that's kind of the theme. And I think that you, on the one hand, show evidence that, maybe we're not necessarily that we're overselling the effects of preschool, but there are these complicated patterns, right? We see this convergence, we see these things. But on the other hand, you ended talking about the inputs, and there was talk in the chat about the ridiculously low teacher pay, but also the ridiculous amount that families are paying to send their kids. And so I'm curious, how do we balance, if we're thinking about going out and talking about this in the world, the complicated story of the effects with the fact that there needs to be more investment in the system? Or how do you talk about the need for investment, knowing all of the complications?
It's quite impressive given everything, all the deck is stacked against these kids and these programs, right? That we see the kinds of benefits that we end up seeing. And so I think from that perspective, given low wages, given low pay, given turnover that is incredibly high, given the lower quality environments some children experience, that we see these boosts is impressive. And so from there, what I would say is, if we just invest a little bit more, can you imagine how much further these kids, or how much more they can benefit from these environments? And we need to be thinking about that, right? Because we see tremendous variability in that initial boost in terms of how much kids are benefiting from. And it's these various inputs that matter. And so we really need to be investing more. And from my perspective, at the end of the day, like, kindergarten, being ready socially, academically for kindergarten is sufficient. That is the important goal. And we need to be thinking about that. Again, as I mentioned, we don't talk about, does first grade work, does second grade work? That's not the question we ever ask, right? We talk about those in terms of how can we make it better? And that's where we need to shift the conversation to, not does early childhood education yield benefits 15, 20, 30 years down the line, but how can we continue to enrich children's experiences? And a key to that solution, or a key to that puzzle, is giving teachers more, because they are the ones that make a difference in the lives of children. Those kids spend 40 hours a week with their teachers. And so it's continuing to improve those experiences, while at the same time acknowledging that they're benefiting from their environments as currently structured is impressive given everything that's going on.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the idea. We need to change the conversation. I think that's a really powerful note to end on. So I want to thank you again for such a great talk, and I want to thank everyone for attending and for participating in the chat and the Q&A. It's been really great to see. Take a quick break, do the survey, and then join us back at 3:15 for the policy panel. It should be a really great way to end the day. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye.